going back to probiotics, it's really interesting because what people think is to take a probiotic because it's going to improve their gut microbiome diversity. These bacteria are going to make their way into the gut, they're going to live there. That's just simply not the case. So our recent research showed this, and it's supported by previous research. So what we did was we gave 40 healthy volunteers, so healthy people, no tummy issues. We gave them a multi-strain probiotic for 3 months, and we looked at the microbiome before and after. And what we saw was that even after 3 months, there was no change in like alpha or beta diversity. Okay, so no change to the diversity of the microbiome, which was pretty, you'd have thought it would be.
Well, something would happen, yeah.
But even previous research shows that in healthy volunteers, probiotic supplementation at least doesn't change the diversity of the microbiome. But what was pretty novel and interesting about our study was that we saw that some of the functional pathways of the microbiome were upregulated or downregulated. Right?
Post-administration,
so
post-consuming them, yeah.
Exactly. We couldn't say whether these changes were good or bad because there wasn't a lot of other data in the literature on that. But it's quite interesting, and it kind of alludes to how probiotics probably work in that you take them, they move through your gut, they interact with your resident microbes in your immune system, and then they pass out, right? They don't stay in your gut, they don't make it their home. And it's quite good actually, because you wouldn't necessarily want them to stay. If you imagine your family or friends coming over for dinner, you enjoy it, but at some point you do want them to move on, right? And I think that's a little bit like how probiotics work, and it's probably why if you're taking a probiotic and it helps your indication, it helps your bloating, it helps your constipation, you probably need to keep taking that. Right. Long term, yeah.
Because it's not sticking around.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because a lot of the companies working in the space, and I guess now we're moving into the field that I'm working in, they're obsessed with something called engraftment. And there's kind of controversy around the term, right? I'll try and break it down into the simplest terms possible. So primary engraftment would be a strain that's present in the product, that's not present in the patient before they get the strain, and then appears post-intervention and then persists as per a defined period of time. We can discuss how long that typically is. That's primary engraftment. Secondary engraftment is a strain that appears post-administration that's not in the product, but may be part of, I don't know, the environment or through a contact with someone they're close to or through food or something along those lines. And engraftment is, for many companies, a measure of what we call pharmacokinetics, which is how drug substance moves through the body and sort of stays within the body after administration. It's a very well-known and well-described pharmacological term, right? So I've always asked the question, why do you need engraftment? And then these companies will say, well, of course, you need the strains to stay there so they can produce their effect. But I've always kicked back and said, well, what if it's just the presence of them being there? Even if it's just transient, that has some sort of effect. And what you've shown, I think, is you don't need engraftment to have some sort of physiological effect. That's what you've shown, in essence. Yeah. Can you talk more about what physiological effects you saw, or is it too notional at this stage to really dig into it?
Yeah, unfortunately at this stage, at least in our study in the healthy volunteers, we can't say because we saw changes in the metabolome, but we don't know if they were positive or negative. And I think
metabolome for the listener is essentially the summary, if you like, or the sum factor of everything that the microbiome is producing. Yeah. Right? So if you imagine the microbiome is an orchestra, the orchestra plays its music, the music is the metabolome.
Yeah.
Something like that, right?
That's a good analogy, right? So we didn't look at many other health markers, so we didn't look at other biomarkers in the blood and stuff. Right. We did look at symptoms, but I think in order to understand, whether these consequential changes are having a benefit, you probably need to look in quite a bit of detail at other physiological systems. But it kind of shows where future study needs to go, right? So as a healthy person, myself, should I take a probiotic? Well, I don't, based on the research. Okay, so I don't take a probiotic. I would, for one reason, well, two reasons. If I was prescribed antibiotics, I would take it. And if I was going to travel somewhere a little bit exotic where I might be at risk of getting, traveller's diarrhoea. But I think the best evidence we have for probiotics at the minute is irritable bowel syndrome, that's IBS, constipation. I would say, again, antibiotic-associated diarrhoea, so reducing the risk of getting diarrhoea from antibiotics, and also improving the eradicacy of H. pylori. So for H. pylori, you have a pretty harsh antibiotic regimen, but there's some evidence to show that certain probiotics can improve that eradication rate, so you're more likely to get rid of it. And then I think 2 other indications, which is where probiotics should be used alongside standard medications. One's ulcerative colitis, and the second is actually depression. I think there's quite a lot of positive evidence. Not anxiety, but clinical depression.
Now, there's almost certainly going to be a listener, many listeners, who either have one of the things you've just mentioned as a potential indication, or know somebody who has one of the potential indications, or they're potentially away travelling, which then I think leads me on to the question of, where do they start?
It's a good
Is
question.
this when we say Tummy MOT?
This is where I'm going to go back to Tummy MOT.
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That is good.
So
that we now have a resource available.
It's a free resource, and I must reiterate that all the products we have on there cannot pay to be on it's purely based on scientific evidence, so we remain as impartial and unbiased as possible, purely based on the evidence. So if they go to the website, tummymot.com, go to review section, you can search by, so we've got like ulcerative colitis, all the probiotics and other supplements that have been shown to help with ulcerative colitis, or they can look at travel if they're going on holiday and they want to know which probiotic they need to take to prevent themselves, to help reduce the risk of getting traveller's diarrhea.
So this is to prevent the deli belly or whatever it's called.
Yeah, exactly.
So you take it before you go away to build up.
And whilst you're away, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But there are other. It's not just probiotics on the website. There's prebiotics. There's just over-the-counter supplements as well. So it's a. Again, I want to say that we're trying to prevent people from becoming patients. So if you're already a patient, you can go to the website. Yeah. But if you're just getting the occasional bit of heartburn or the occasional bit of bloating and you just want to try something to see if it can resolve that before you need to go be referred on to a specialist and then they're sending you for more invasive tests, then just go to the website and see what's available.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about probiotics, how to select one, good indications for probiotics, or potential indications, I should say. We've talked now about the Tummy MOT. I think it brings me on quite nicely to some of the other things that are in our toolkit. So prebiotics, for example. So should we just start off with what a prebiotic is, and what is your experience of probiotics and how they sit within the kind of potential therapeutic toolkit or something that someone could take themselves?
Sure. So prebiotics are usually foods, or they can be supplements that, when taken, they support the growth of good bacteria in the gut, and then that gives you some sort of health benefit, right? So again, it's that focus on you have to have a health benefit from taking the prebiotic. There are foods that naturally contain prebiotics. They're usually vegetables to some extent, but their supplements are also quite interesting because what they do is they take the prebiotics from the vegetables and they make it more accessible and more obtainable, right? So there's lots of different prebiotics. Again, we have some on the website. I think they're slightly different to probiotics. This is something as a healthy person I would probably take every day, and I do take a prebiotic every day. So there's different ones that target different bacteria. So you can take a prebiotic that targets bacteria that produce butyrate, for example. So butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that's super important for gut health and actually functioning of the gut. So you can take a prebiotic that supports those. You can take a prebiotic that supports things like bifidobacteria, which are, again, important for immune health. So yeah, I think prebiotics are definitely more appropriate for healthy people, and it's something you want to take every day just to maintain the good bacteria in the microbiome, whereas I think probiotics are probably a little bit better for certain indications.
If someone wants to start taking a probiotic to improve their health, and I know you're probably going to say go to Tummy MOT, which is cool, what are some of the general guiding principles? You talked about vegetables. Is there like a certain group of probiotics? You know, I've heard of
prebiotics.
Prebiotics. I've heard of inulin, for example. There's the celluloses.
Yeah.
Which type of fibre?
So there's one thing that we should say about prebiotics is that you can get fermentable and non-fermentable prebiotics. And for people with digestive issues like irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, prebiotics can actually be a little bit tricky and provocative to their symptoms, because what happens is if they do have an imbalance in the microbiome, they do have SIBO, then they take a prebiotic, it gets fermented, it produces a lot of gas, you get the bloating, you get the tummy pain, right? So there's fermentable and there's non-fermentable prebiotics. My favourite prebiotics tend to be the or less fermentable ones, right? These are things like partially hydrolyzed guar gum. So the actual fibre, the prebiotic, has been partially metabolized by bacteria already. So it's less likely to cause symptoms when you take it. It has a multitude of potential benefits for both constipation and also diarrhea. And it's also a kind of soluble fibre. So again, some of the best prebiotics tend to fall under the more soluble fibre arm, right? Because you've got so we've talked about partially hydrolyzed guar gum in foods. Another one of my favourites is beta glucan, which is found in oats, and actually mushrooms are a really good source of it as well. Inulin is a fermentable.
So just one question. How do people know if the partially hydrolyzed guar gum is in their food or not? Is that
so? This is the thing. It's not something that's found in food, right? So guar gum is a naturally occurring substance, not necessarily found in foods. It's added to a lot of foods. It's actually a commonly used emulsifier that some people might be scared of.
Oh, this is a controversial.
Yeah, this is controversial, and we can get into emulsifiers as well. But there's a lot of different emulsifiers, just like artificial sweeteners and sweeteners. Like some of them are probably okay, and some of them less so. So guar gum is actually been shown to be beneficial in studies, right? It increases levels of butyrate-producing bacteria. So these are the bacteria that produce butyrate are normally the fermenters. They like to feed on stuff,
right?
Like feed on fibre. Partially hydrolyzed guar gum is you take the guar gum and you hydrolyze it, usually from a bacterial source, right? And it still promotes the growth of butyrate-producing bacteria, but it's less harsh on the gut, should we say. So actually people with sensitive stomachs can usually take this, whereas they struggle a bit more with the guar gum. But that's a unique prebiotic, right? There's prebiotics in foods like beta-glucan we've just touched on, inulin. But inulin is another super fermentable prebiotic, which is found in garlic, onions, and it's what sets a lot of people's IBS off. It's actually a FODMAP. So FODMAPs are fermentable carbohydrates, basically. And if you've got irritable bowel syndrome, you probably have tried the low FODMAP diet at some point, which is where you remove these foods, so usually plant foods, right? So fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, that are high in these fermentable compounds. But those fermentable compounds are usually prebiotics. So when you go on the low FODMAP diet,
right?
You lose a lot of your beneficial microbes.
Yeah. So you're reducing diversity.
You're reducing diversity,
almost,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. But what happens with the low FODMAP diet is it's not a lifelong diet, right? It's actually an elimination diet, and then you reintroduce certain FODMAPs because you might just be intolerant to the inulin, right? But you're okay with other stuff. But what a lot of people do is they end up on the low FODMAP diet for life in the restrictive phase, when really after 3 months they should know which FODMAPs they can't deal with. And I will say, if you've tried the low FODMAP diet and you're struggling with different FODMAPs like fructose, like inulin, like lactose, you're struggling with more than one, then that might be when it's something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth that's manifesting as. Right. Yeah, all right. So when these prebiotics are hitting the small bowel, these bacteria are having a go, and you're getting the bloating, which is, again, why some prebiotics aren't for everyone. And neither are probiotics. But
on this low FODMAP diet, then, is this a potential avenue for people that have got diarrhea predominant, just going back to the start, constipation predominant mix? Is it a good thing to try for everybody?
Yeah, so it's the most effective diet for IBS when you look at the literature. But yeah, it's restrictive in the first instance because you're removing a lot of food groups, and we know that affects diversity. Diversity is super important because the more diverse your microbiome is, there's more. It's associated with more health outcomes, and there's animal studies to show that having more diverse microbes, you're less likely to develop different diseases and intestinal infections and so on and so forth. So it's really important, but actually the studies show that when you finish the low FODMAP diet, your diversity is pretty much back to baseline.